Hello, Yu-Gi-Oh players, and welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! In Business Casual. I'm your host, the RJB0. Today, I am joined by my cat, Shadows. Everybody say hi to Shadows. Anyway, if I was invited onto Real Time with Bill Maher, and Bill Maher said, "Hey, RJ, why don't you make the new rule for today?" or one of them, I would say, alright, new rule. Yu-Gi-Oh players need to stop complaining about Dragon Rulers. Actually, my real new rule would probably be something funnier, uh, just generally better, probably something politically minded. But the point is, if there's one thing that annoys me the most and that I'm the most tired of and sick of, it's Yu-Gi-Oh players complaining about Dragon Rulers. I think that players who are complaining about Dragon Rulers right now just haven't been paying much attention. Either they do not have the skill to make a deck or to play the game in a way that counters them and can play against them, or they just have a thing for complaining about the meta and they don't care what the deck is. Because let's face it, Dragon Plants in the scheme of things and other Dragon Ruler decks aren't that bad. For instance, I would much rather have my opponent open with a Dragasack and 6 cards in hand than with a Shocklock and 3 cards in the back row, or a Logia and 4 cards in the back row, or having my opponent open broke with Inzectors, or with Crush Card Virus, or anything like that. In the grand scheme of things, now suddenly Dragasack and 6 cards in hand doesn't sound that bad. And one of the things I like about this format, and the fact that Dragon Rulers, yes, are the tier 1, is that this follows the Super Smash Bros. Melee thing, or the Pokemon rule, which is that if everything is broken, then the game is not that bad. And if they're all broken in a way that doesn't, limit player interaction or anything like that, and Dragon Rulers are, and there are a lot of decks this format. Like, Dragon Ruler's greatest advantage, one of the things that people say makes them so herp derp, is that they have access to tons of resources. But let's face it, every top tier deck this format has access to tons of resources. They're all broken in the same way, they just have different strategies. And I think that in a format where everybody has access to a ton of resources, the same strategies are not going to be as big of power plays as you would think they would be. And dragons now are facing a bunch of decks with similar strengths to them, and a game against dragon plants is much better than, once again, a game against Dino Rabbit or something like that. It's really a game of skill. And the reason why I say dragons take a lot of skill, and why I'm annoyed that people keep saying that they're totally herp derp, is they take tons of resource management skill. Especially in a format where everybody has access to tons of resources, it means that wasting your resources is even more of a problem. It's even more deadly. And you can tell good Dragon Plant players from bad Dragon Plant players and other forms of Dragon Rulers. I'm going to continue saying Dragon Plants. But you can definitely tell the difference. A good Dragon Plant player will say, whatever. A good Dragon player will save their resources, their draw cards, their dragons, their searches, for when they need them. They'll use them to set up plays, and then they'll sit back on them, and they'll use their resources more passive-aggressively to give them a more continuous stream of plays. And you can tell the bad Dragon Ruler users because they'll just use up all those resources. They'll just blow through their resources just using tons and tons of draw power, and that kills them. Which means that the fact that you have so many resources doesn't make the deck suddenly broken. You have to actually be able to manage them, and that takes skill. And in fact, I'm going to say another thing that's really controversial here, which is that I think that Dragon Rulers actually play, ooh, my voice cracked, that hasn't happened in ages, actually play a lot like a new and improved version of Junk Doppel. Let's see what the comparisons are. They rely most on monster effects. They use cards that are normally minus, or effects that are normally minuses, in order to set up plays to move on to bigger plays. Their most important plays come from the extra deck, and the game for them is resource management and timing. That in that way they are extremely similar. The difference is that you have to trade off one thing for another, and I'll get to that, which is that in a Dragon Ruler deck, you have to plan more than you have to with Junk Doppel in a single turn. You have to keep track of which Dragon Rulers I've used. If you use one of the effects to set up, maybe you can't special summon a monster with that same effect. And it just takes a ton of planning, as opposed to Junk Doppel, where you can look at your resources in your hand and in your graveyard and you can understand all the plays that you make right off the bat. So it's harder to play a Dragon Ruler plant deck, but in the long run, the trade-off is that they have greater resources, greater power, and more speed. So they're very similar decks, but Dragon Rulers just happen to be better. And I personally consider Junk Doppel to be the most fun deck of all time. So if a deck, just the biggest advantage it has over the most fun deck of all time, the thing that makes it better and more broken, is the tons of resources it has, then against a format where every deck has access to a ton of resources, it can't be that horrid to play against. And the other thing about Dragon Rulers is they're beatable. It takes planning and it takes thought, and you can look at plays and you can see how they can beat Dragon Rulers. It isn't like against a Logia and 4 back row where you're facing unknown resource after unknown resource and your opponent can just keep you off the board, which is what stun decks do, but that was just a little crazy. Against Dragon Rulers, you're actually going back and forth. You're using your monsters to remove your opponent's cards and gain a foothold over them, and then they have to recover and come back, and it keeps going back and forth like that. It is a very back and forth game, which is what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is supposed to look like. It's supposed to be a game of back and forth card management. So, in conclusion, I might actually have to make Dragon Plants, because they are a deck that, if they're similar to Junk Doppel, are very much my playstyle. It's difficult to use, which means that it won't improve my skill. And to summarize the things that I have said about why Dragon Plants aren't that bad and people need to stop complaining about them. Their broken plays are still beatable, and they aren't as bad to play against as previous top tier decks. They, in a format where everything has giant amounts of resources, they don't have the herp derp power that you'd think that they have, where you can recover from your misplays, because if every deck has that same amount of recovery power, that same amount of advantage, misplays hurt you just as much as they would in a deck with fewer resources in a format that uses fewer resources. And then because it plays like one of the most fun decks in history. So I don't know how to finish this video. I'm just going to say, stop being so butthurt. It isn't that bad. You can beat them. They're good, yes, but they're good in a skillful way, in a way that takes thought, and the people who say that they don't take skill and that they're herp derp and that it's a terrible format just aren't paying attention, or they aren't putting the effort in to actually play the game. So there you go. I hope you guys like this video. I hope you guys aren't just going to flame at me about it. If you did hit that thumbs up button, or if you do, yes, I did that right. If you did like it, hit that thumbs up button. If you didn't, let me know why, and we can actually discuss this in the comments below. And then, of course, if you aren't subscribed to me already, you guys can see more analysis like this, as well as Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel news and more, if you subscribe to me. Hit that button below, or maybe it's above now. Anyway, thank you guys for watching Yu-Gi-Oh! And Business Casual. I'm your host, the RJB0, and I got a jet. See you guys.